Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. George Kapalka. I am the director of the Master of Science in Clinical Psychopharmacology program at Alliant International University. Welcome to this psychopharmacology podcast, where we interview in this series the pioneers of the RxP movement in various levels, national levels, state levels, especially focusing on some of the early efforts that have kind of opened the door for a number of other states to pass RxP since then. I am thrilled today to have as my guest Dr. Glenn Alley, who is one of the pioneers of the RxP movement in Louisiana. He had also been involved on a national level, for example, in APA governance that had to do with RxP. I want to get to all of these topics with him today. There's so much to cover. But I do have an initial question. I'm kind of curious about it, and maybe a little aspect of it that most people are unfamiliar. So, um, the RxP movement, in terms of states passing, most people are aware of the date 2002, which is when New Mexico passed its initial RxP legislation, and New Mexico was the first state to do so. But what folks may not be aware of is that actually in Louisiana, these efforts went back even further, because my understanding is that some interest in RxP in Louisiana really started in the mid to late 1990s. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that, about those early days of RxP interest in Louisiana and how that eventually came to be known as the medical psychologist profession that we have.
Sure. And thank you, George, for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate that. I think it's important that we have some record of our history, and we need to kind of perpetuate what worked and even the eras that didn't work. So thank you for having this podcast. I really appreciate that. Actually, the RxP effort started way back in 1984 with Senator Daniel Inouye, who presented to the Hawaii Psychological Association the concept of psychologists prescribing. After that, in 1985, Hawaii introduced the first bill, actually. And Hawaii's been trying ever since, but they've had a difficult time with it. In 1989, the Defense Department started the Psychopharmacology Demonstration Project, which trained through the military services 10 psychologists to prescribe. That training lasted from 1991 to 1997 and graduated 10 psychologists who went on to be prescribing psychologists in the military.
And we will actually have two separate episodes devoted, one to the Hawaii movement and Dr. De Leon's involvement with Senator Inouye, and then also the DoD project. So thank you for mentioning it. These are very important milestones.
Exactly. And those were the start of our interest as well in prescribing psychology. Few folks know that in 1993, Indiana enacted a public law that authorized psychologists to prescribe in federal government-sponsored facilities. But there was no one trained and no one prescribing at that time. But that statute was on the books. Journey began in 1994, actually, when Dr. John Bolter asked Dr. James Quillen if he would like to pursue prescriptive authority in Louisiana. We had several enabling legislative acts, if you will, on the books already. We had a freedom of choice bill that was on the books. We had hospital staff membership. I was actually instrumental in getting hospital staff membership passed in Louisiana. I had a hospital practice. Dr. Quillen had a hospital practice. Dr. Bolter had a hospital practice. So it was important to us to be on medical staff in hospitals. So that was already in place. That law was already in place. Law was in place for psychologists to execute civil commitments. for nurses to accept orders written by psychologists in the hospital setting. So we had several pieces of legislation that were already into law at that time. Dr. Bolter approached Dr. Quillen. Dr. Quillen wanted to know who was supportive, who was financing, et cetera, all the things that you need to know in a political environment. And George, let me stress that passing an RxP statute is not about psychology. It's about politics. Okay. This is purely about politics. Getting any law passed in any state is about the politics of that state.
Yes. And when it comes to that, all politics are local.
Exactly. In Louisiana, politics and passing legislation is about two things. It's about relationships and it's about money. Okay. So, with that in mind, Dr. Quillen set about finding out who was favorable in Louisiana and what we were going to be able to do to try and get legislation passed. We actually put a bill forward in 1997, and to our surprise, it passed committee. It got out of committee favorably, the first time it has happened in the country. But we didn't have a whole lot of finances, and we didn't have the lobbyist at the time that could push it forward. So it died after committee. But we learned several things that were extremely important. We learned, one, who is the opposition? We learned, two, who are the opposition lobbyists and how strong are they in the legislature? We learned who our legislative friends were and who our enemies were going to be in the legislature. We learned a very important lesson, that is, who were the players? When I say who were the players, who were the legislators that had influence in the legislature? The other thing we learned were what are the arguments that we're going to face in trying to pass this bill? We also learned what our legislators would support and what they wouldn't support. And we learned this would be a process of dedication. It was going to take a while. It was going to take not just one effort and get it through and get it passed. It was going to take several attempts at it. And we learned the big thing, we needed a bunch of money to get this passed. We had actually met with optometry. Optometry had recently got some prescriptive privileges passed. We met with them to find out what it would take, how much money they spent on getting this legislation passed. They told us it was about $250,000 to get their legislation passed. So we knew we were looking at a significant amount of money for us.
And that's 1990s money. So that's
Exactly. Legislators will always seek to avoid controversy. And we knew one of their ploys was to try and have the opposing parties meet. At our hearing, that first legislative effort, obviously psychiatry was opposed. The two medical schools in the state were opposed. We had a consumer group, NAMI, the National Association for Mental Illness, was opposed and sent people to testify against our bill. So we met with psychiatry because we knew the legislature was going to ask us to do so. And obviously they were opposed and didn't want anything to do with that. But we wanted that on record that we did meet with them and we attempted to get some compromise there. We had no one trained at that time. With this, Dr. Quillen, Dr. Bolter decided we need to get some people trained so that we have someone to point to when we went to the legislature and say, here are the folks that have been trained. If you will recall, and I know you were involved at that time, if you will recall, there were two programs training psychologists at the time to prescribe, two civilian programs. One was the PPR by Dr. Sam Feldman, and I think the other was Dr. Nassetti had one in Nebraska or thereabouts. Well, we had talked to Dr. Feldman about perhaps sponsoring our program, but we knew our legislators were not going to support any program that involved continuing education. They simply said, we know what you guys do on continuing education. You check in and then you go play golf and then you come back and get your credit. So
So
they weren't.
that's a really important point, and I'm so glad
Yes,
that we got to it because that was something I wanted to spend some time on. You know, just like you mentioned, the other training programs and even the initial version of the statute that was passed in New Mexico did not require the postdoctoral master's degree. It was a continuing education, although it had to be connected with the university. And of course, we had the practical component to it, but you did not have to complete the training as additional degree and actual college classes. So it's kind of, you know, with you actually kind of going in that direction, it really started the whole movement, which then gradually became the national standard, which is that prescribing psychologists now complete the postdoctoral masters in clinical psychopharmacology. But most people don't know that that actually started because Louisiana
that's
wanted to
correct.
follow that particular model.
The initial model was an APA model. APA formed a blue ribbon committee to decide what would be the training program for psychologists to prescribe. And they kind of mirrored the program of the PDP program of the prescribing psychologists in the military. It was something like 300 hours. Dr. Bolter is actually the one who developed what came to be our master's level program. He's the one that put together the curriculum along with Dr. Morgan Salmons, who was one of the PDP graduates, put together a master's degree program that was 450 hours rather than the 300 hours recommended by APA. Then it was up to us to find a program that would sponsor or accept our masters or develop our masters even further. We shopped it around. Obviously, the two medical schools here passed on it because they testified in opposition. So Tulane and LSU's medical school passed on it. We then went to the PharmD programs in the state. We have two PharmD programs in the state. And one of the PharmD programs, it's a historically Black university in New Orleans, Xavier University, said, sure, we'll do the master's program for you. Well, we were all set. We got 50 guys and gals in the first class, 50 psychologists who wanted to complete this program. They were 2 weeks away, had textbooks, had everything set up, 2 weeks away. And Xavier pulled the rug out from under us, saying, nope, we're not going to do it any longer. We have a feeling that they had gotten pressure from the medical schools and decided they were not going to fight that fight. So we shopped around a little bit more. And finally, met up with Steve Tolkien at CSPP and California School of Professional Psychology.
California School of Professional Psychology, which now is part of Alliant International University. So we have such a close connection to it because we were actually the first master's program in the country.
That's correct. And Steve said, yes, we'd be happy to take it. The first class went through the program tuition free, I might add. The first class met, we got some classrooms in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And we hired our own faculty, actually, because we wanted the faculty to be above reproach. We wanted the faculty to be homegrown so that the legislature could not pick apart who were our faculty. The faculty taught the medical students, and they taught us as well. The first class went every other weekend for 2 years to complete the master's program. They met in Baton Rouge face to face and spent the entire weekend in the classroom. Okay. We also had, unlike some of the other programs, we had our assessment included in our program. That is, people will have, and they call it an internship, an externship, various terminology used for their supervision by a physician or someone doing assessments. We did that concurrent with our classwork. So we didn't include one at the end of the master's program because we had done it concurrently. The first class started in 1998 and they finished in 2000. The second class was 23 students we had signed up. I was in the second class. And we graduated 15 out of that 23 that we initially signed up. Let me backtrack a little bit. The first class was 35. We graduated 50 altogether. So the 35 graduated in the first class and the 15 graduated in the second class. We graduated in 2002. Did the same thing. We went every third weekend for 2 years in Baton Rouge, face to face, and completed the program. It was during our class, our second class, that CSPP changed to Alliant University so that our degrees, we wanted to make sure our degrees were from CSPP. So the second class also has their degree from CSPP. It wasn't tuition free for the second class, but it was nearly tuition free. So we owe a great debt to Alliant and to CSPP for taking on that program. We also helped them to get approved in the Western District to offer programs. Politically, we helped them to get approved in the legislature to offer programs and offer degrees in Louisiana. So that was the kind of the background. We tried several times to introduce a bill. We introduced another bill in 1999. We have an every other legislative year. The odd years are legislative, the even years are fiscal years. So the legislators can only introduce fiscal matters, but each one gets 5 bills that they can introduce. We actually tried to in 2000, but it was an election year, and our representative said, please don't introduce anything controversial this year. And we kind of backed out of that. We went through several lobbyists until we found the right guys to do the lobbying job. That was Mr. Jim Nickel and Mr. Bud Corson were the lobbyists who got the bill finally through. These guys were just amazing. Like I said, we tried several times. In 1999, we introduced another bill, but if you will recall, that was the year when Dr. Laura, the radio personality, lambasted the American Psychological Association for some studies that came out. And eventually, legislatures across the country passed resolutions condemning APA for their stance on some of that literature. So we withdrew our bill because we knew it wasn't going anywhere. We had tried again a couple of times in the legislature, and we learned a couple of other things. Remember, I said that National Alliance of the Mentally Ill testified against us. Well, they testified against us a couple of times in the legislation. They were effective because they brought family members, they brought people with mental illness to testify in favor of psychiatry.
Right. So closely aligned with psychiatry, actually.
Exactly. So at that time, we were having a meeting, and I turned to Dr. Bolter and I said, why can't we develop our own consumer group? And he looked at me and his eyes got wide open. He said, can we do that? I said, why not? He said, how can we do it ethically? I said, well, let's talk to APA and let's get some advice from legal counsel and see if we can do it. So in that year, LaFACT was born, Louisiana Families for Access to Comprehensive Treatment, LaFACT. We developed our own consumer group. We had pamphlets in our waiting rooms and mail outs and things like that, which essentially asked if you would like your psychologist to prescribe your psychotropic medication, please ask how. And what
is still active, right?
the fact is still out there, yes. What we did was we took their name and address and we would mail to them information about, and remember I said the election year was coming up, we'd mail information to them on who was supportive of RxP in their area. So between the dog and pony shows that we did, we'd go, Louisiana is parishes, not counties. We went to each parish where the representatives and senators were. We presented a program there. We obviously brought checks with us, contributions to their campaigns and things of that nature. And we developed our consumer group. At the time, NAMI had about 700 members. When we were finished, we had 6,000 members in our LaFACT group, so that we were a voice to be reckoned with through LaFACT. And after that, after we had LaFACT come and testify once, we never testified in opposition again. They never came to testify at all, actually. In 2001, LAMP was formed, Louisiana Academy of Medical Psychologists.
I have a quick question about that because I noticed that the name LAMP is actually kind of an anagram of the Louisiana Psychiatric Medical Association. I was kind of wondering if that was intentional.
Actually, no, that was sort of a serendipitous accident, George.
But it's the same letters, right? Yeah.
Exactly. But the thing that's important in that is the name medical psychologist. Remember, at the time, there were no bills that had passed. New Mexico passed theirs in 2002. The people in the PDP program, the psychologists that were prescribing in the military, they were wrestling with what to call themselves. They didn't know what to call themselves. And I think that just kind of by accident, they became prescribing psychologists. We tossed that around quite a bit. In fact, I was on council at the time as well, on the APA council, and a lot of folks were upset with the idea that we were going to use this term medical psychologist. And there were two reasons for that. Number one, we felt that prescribing psychologists described a behavior. That's what psychologists do, they prescribe. That's not what we were after. We don't call neuropsychologists testing psychologists. They do that, but they're much more than testing. We thought that we were much more than prescribing. So we wanted the term medical psychologist because that was a field of study. It wasn't a behavior. It wasn't something just that we did. So medical psychologist was really important to us to include that. The second reason was we had heard at one of our hearings that you guys just don't have enough medical education. So from that point forward, it was medical psychologist, and every course that we had the term medical in front of it. So it was medical assessment, it was medical biochemistry, everything was medical to, again, kind of dissuade that line of attack on our bill. LAMP was kind of formed as or Louisiana Academy of Medical Psychologists, LAMP as we call it. LAMP was formed as a sister organization to LPA, Louisiana Psychological Association.
What was LPA's view towards that?
LPA, we had originally done a survey, and the majority was in favor. We have about the same statistic that most of the states had at the time on prescribing psychologists, medical psychologists. There wasn't a clear super majority, but there were a majority of psychologists who were in favor of it. Even those who said they wouldn't pursue it thought it was a good extension of psychology. So it was formed as a sister organization. And in LAMP, the charter members were those first 50 medical psychologists, the first class and the second class. It was 10% of the licensed psychologists in Louisiana. So we felt pretty good about that. 2003 was the election year. We kind of didn't introduce a bill that year. LaFACT, like I said, was born at that time. It was also the start of the quotes that Dr. Quillen would have. He would do things like he would sign his email with Q, just the letter Q for Quillen, and comma MTJT. And we all go, what is this? It's more than just talk. So we do more than just talk therapy. Okay. And Dr. Quillen's famous saying, if we do not quit, we will win. All of those sayings started around that time, okay? One of them was, you can't kill us if you can't catch us. Okay, so it was important to us to be nimble in the legislature, to do things quickly as we could.
Did you see the opposition from psychiatry gradually diminish?
Well, interestingly, we had obviously opposition from psychiatry, and that has never changed. Psychiatry has always been opposed and continues to be opposed to any expansion or anything that medical psychologists do. But the general practice physicians, the other MDs, were supportive. When our bill went to the governor for signature, we had Dr. Mike Berard was one of the individuals who was very important from the Acadiana area. From Acadiana is the French-speaking area of Louisiana and Cajun country, if you will. Actually, where I am, and Dr. Lowe is there. Several of the original people were there. Dr. Berard collected signatures of physicians in the area. He had signatures of 54 physicians who signed letters on their letterhead in support of medical psychology. And one of those physicians was actually the nephew of the governor at the time, Governor Kathleen Blanco. So we had those when the bill was on Governor Blanco's desk. We brought in those 54 letters of physician supporters along with her nephew's letter of support. So I think that kind of helped us along with that. But we were supported by a lot of folks who were MDs. People in the hospital knew of us. We were in the hospital. I used to eat in the doctor's dining room all the time in the hospital, in the general hospital. So they were familiar with me. They knew me. They consulted me in the hospital. Same thing with Dr. Quillen and Dr. Bolter. That was something that I think we moved through the process of recognizing that psychiatry would never be supportive of this. Okay. Now, again, if you get down to individual psychiatrists, some may be more supportive than others, but as a collective, they're going to support what the association supports.
You're making such an interesting point because that's been seen, I think, to maybe to a lesser extent, but still, that's been seen increasingly in other states too, that organized medicine, while traditionally supporting psychiatrists, no longer does so uniformly as much as they used to. So being able to split them off, if you will, to have medicine have a different stance towards it rather than psychiatry, which always will be opposed, was, I think, a very important strategic move.
Right. And George, as I mentioned before about politics being about relationships, that's very important also. The relationship between psychology and general medicine. It's extremely important. They're referral sources for us. They're the ones who send people to see us. We should and do, more often than not, send them information about the progress of their patient, things like that. That relationship is extremely important between the psychologist and the general practitioner. And I think we keep that relationship going and better than psychiatry does. I think psychiatry has kind of fallen short of continuing that relationship. Relationships are extremely important. We in psychology ought to know that, and we need to not only explore that, but make it happen. Okay, make the relationships happen. Again, as an aside, one of the things that I did when I moved into the community that I moved into was I started getting involved in organizations. Not only did I eat in the doctor's dining room at the hospital, but I got involved in the local Kiwanis Club. I got involved in the country club, the golf country club. I started playing golf. I hadn't played golf. I wasn't interested in golf, but I began getting interested in golf when I found most of the doctors played golf. So I would play golf. Again, just an aside with this, I played golf with our U.S. congressperson every Wednesday. I made sure I was off on Wednesdays and he was in the foursome, in my foursome. So my congressman, my U.S. congressman, was a golf buddy for 10 years, 12 years. He was a physician first. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon who became a U.S. congressman, but he was in our golf foursome. So, relationships become important. There's one story when we were looking for lobbyists. We had a lobbyist who was really ineffective, and I had been president that year of LPA, and LPA was pushing. This was 1998. LPA was pushing mental health parity at the time, and they wanted that passed. So it was going before a committee. We put a bill up. It was going before a committee. I was going to testify before that committee. And the lobbyist said, Glenn, this is not going to get out of committee. Don't feel bad. Just say what you got to say. Don't worry about it. We'll handle it later, but this is not getting out of committee. I turned to him. I said, do you want this out of committee? He said, well, that would be nice, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to work. I said, okay. So I went up to the railing where the legislators were by the dais up front, and I spoke to one of the representatives. He went and he talked to the chair of the committee. And went into session. The chair of the committee says, this bill on mental health parity, let's pass it by unanimous consent. Bang the gavel, and it passed. The lobbyist looked at me. He said, what did you say? I said, that representative up there that I spoke to, his name is Glenn Ansardi. He went to Holy Cross High School. In Catholic high school, how do you sit? You sit in alphabetical order. My name is Glenn Alley. I sat right next to him all through high school. So it's about relationships. He went talked to the chair. The chair used to be the one of the Pan American insurance representatives. Later became the insurance commissioner. Knew him very well. So those relationships are extremely important.
When you guys passed the statute in 2004 and you were able to get the rules promulgated pretty quickly, because it took you about a year or so in comparison with New Mexico, where it took almost 3 years. Would you say that's one of the reasons, because you had all those relationships, why the rulemaking process went more smoothly in Louisiana?
Well, here again, there were a couple of things. Let me back up to when the statute passed. Okay. In 2004, our bill was sponsored by the Speaker of the House, Representative Joe Salter, and sponsored by the President of the Senate, who was a physician, Dr. Don Hines. They were the sponsors of our bill. The House Health and Welfare Committee was one of our strong supporters, and the House and Welfare Committee in the Senate was also one of our strong supporters. So if you have the bill going before committee chairs that want that bill passed, and the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate want that bill passed, you get it passed. So that was years of relationships, developing those relationships. And again, a couple of little side story here. Committee chair of the House Health and Welfare Committee was a Representative Sidney Mae Duran, female near where I am in Lafayette. She had a knee replacement and was in the hospital on the rehab unit, and I was consulted on her. I had gone see her in the hospital, and she was in tears. I said, I know this is a painful procedure, but what's the problem? The physician on her case had come into her room and read her the riot act because she was supporting our bill. So I spent a good several hours in therapy with her there, getting her to get over that anger. But she said, your bill is as good as passed in our committee. I said, oh, thank you very much. But, This is something that I think is important for the state, not just for me or for this little group of people here. And she agreed, but she was upset because that's what the physicians would do. The physicians would use their time with patients in their office to talk to them about opposing our bill. So you have to overcome some of those things. So in 2004, we introduced a bill, passed. When I said, Dr. Quillen's phrase, you can't kill us if you can't catch us, we introduced a bill in both houses of Congress at the same time. We introduced it in the Senate and we introduced it in the House at the same time, so that we had it pass in the Senate committee, and we literally ran from one to the other to testify in the other branch of government. Then came the process of the floor votes. We had that pass in 6 legislative days, which was unheard of, absolutely unheard of. And still to this day, no one has been able to pass legislation in 6 legislative days. Then we had to get concurrence on it because the Senate had changed a few things, tweaked a few things here and there. And as our lobbyist is getting on the elevator to go up to the Speaker's office and the President of the Senate's offices, the elevator door is coming closed like this, and there's a hand that goes in the elevator door and opens the elevator door, and it's the Medical Society's lobbyist. And she says, "Bud, are you going for concurrence on this today?" And Bud Corson, our lobbyist, says, I can't lie. I can't lie to people. He told her, "Yes, I am." And the door is closed like that. And we got concurrence on that very day. So now comes the rulemaking process. And on to your question. New Mexico, when they passed their statute in 2002, the rulemaking committee had psychiatrists on the rulemaking committee, and they drugged their feet in passing rules. They couldn't agree on anything. In fact, I think the governor disbanded one group and set up another group to try and pass some rules. For us, the rules were up to the medical psychologist to write. So we wrote a set of rules. Dr. Quillen, Dr. Bolter sent it to the Cajun Mafia, to Dr. Warren Lowe, myself, and Dr. Berard in Lafayette. We went through it with a fine-tooth comb. We tweaked it a little bit, and we published the rules in the register, in the state register. Now, if there's any opposition, any written opposition to those rules, then it has to go to a hearing, and we get to set up the hearing. So we had a public hearing. We decided that we were going to make it as inconvenient as possible for people to testify. So we had the hearing in the northernmost city of the state, make it as remote as possible, and we held it on the day before Thanksgiving. So that, there was little opposition to the rules. People wouldn't travel that far. We did have some Tulane send some representatives, Tulane Medical School, and you recognize that Tulane Medical School has a psychiatry program there. So they're very invested in opposing this. The late Dr. David Post was there. He testified on behalf of LPA. Dr. Quillen testified on behalf of LPA. I testified on behalf of APA. And one of the physicians who was in opposition said something about he didn't like the idea that we were going to have MP after our name. He thought that it would be too confusing with MD. So Dr. Post got a chance to rebut his testimony and said, "We promise to write legibly if you will." The whole room just erupted in laughter. But the rules then, the information, the feedback from the rules then goes to a committee of the legislature, and they decide whether there is any substantive difference between the rules and the statute. And there wasn't. So the rules were accepted, and we were done. So in 2005, February 2005, Dr. John Bolter was the first psychologist under a psychologist license to write a prescription for Remeron.
Yeah, it was around the same time because actually Dr. Maria Marquez and Elaine Levine, their conditional licenses were also dated in February of 2005. So those were the first three in the country outside of the military.
Exactly, outside of the military. And, it not only was a momentous kind of occasion for us, but it didn't stop there. It's another process whereby our statute had included in it that psychologists could prescribe psychotropic medications for mental health purposes and can prescribe for potential side effects of those medications. The only thing we were limited to is we could not prescribe opioids or opioid derivatives. Now, other states who passed statutes have had various kind of formularies and things like that, but we had a wide open range of medications that we could prescribe. We couldn't prescribe for health reasons, like I couldn't prescribe antihypertensives for people who had hypertension. I couldn't prescribe antibiotics or something like that, but I can prescribe medications, anti-nausea medication or things like that for the side effects of the medicines that I do prescribe. And the other thing is I was able to begin ordering tests, lab work, things like that, to monitor the medications. I've ordered MRIs. I've ordered brain MRIs to kind of differentiate uh, sort of neurologic problems versus psychological problems. And if there's anything that is showing up in an MRI, I refer that to the appropriate source. But I'm able to order tests to assess my patient, basically.
Thank you for listening to part one of my conversation with Dr. Glenn Alley. We've covered how the prescriptive authority movement in Louisiana took shape, its early political battles, the origins of the first MSCP training program at the California School of Professional Psychology, which is now part of Alliant International University, and the landmark moment when psychologists first began writing prescriptions in early 2005. But that's only half the story. In part two, Dr. Ali and I explore how prescriptive authority has evolved, the challenges it faced then and still faces now, and what it means for the future of medical and prescribing psychology. I hope you'll join us. And to learn more about what's happening now and next in RxP, be sure to check out our Psychopharmacology Today podcast at alliance.edu/podcasts. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next time.